The quiet moments often speak the loudest. Beneath the surface of everyday life, there are stories of struggle, resilience, and unspoken love. For Ms. Brenda, the worrying look on Josh's face was a silent cry for help, one that would set off a chain of events that would change everything. Let us know where you are watching from, as this story unveils hidden eventualities. The soft hum of chatter filled the classroom as students worked on their art projects, but Ms. Brenda couldn't focus on their joyful energy. Her eyes kept drifting to Josh. He was at the back of the room, bent over his paper, scribbling. His posture was slumped, and his usual quietness had turned into something heavier. She noticed how he kept scratching at his arms, which made the sleeves of his sweater pull up just slightly. That's when she saw them again, the reddish marks on his pale skin. Brenda frowned. The marks had been there before, but they seemed worse now. Josh's face was pale, and there was a weariness about him that didn't belong on an 8-year-old. She stood, making her way toward his desk. "Hey, Josh," she said softly, kneeling beside him. Josh, startled, quickly tugging his sleeves down. "Hi, Miss Brenda," he murmured, keeping his eyes on his paper. "What are you drawing?" she asked, leaning closer. "A dog," he said, holding up a shaky sketch of a floppy-eared pup. "It's great," Brenda said with a warm smile, then hesitated. "Josh, can I ask you something?" He didn't look up but gave a small nod. "I noticed some marks on your arms. Did you fall or hurt yourself?" Her tone was gentle, but she felt the boy stiffen immediately. "I'm fine, really," he said quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure?" Brenda pressed gently. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me." Josh shook his head and gave her a forced smile. "I'm okay. Promise." Brenda didn't believe him, but she didn't want to push too hard. "All right. But if you ever need to talk, I'm here, okay?" He nodded again, but his eyes stayed fixed on his drawing. That evening, Brenda couldn't shake her worry. Sitting at her desk, she picked up her phone and dialed the number listed as Josh's emergency contact. "Hello, Mrs. Timothy. This is Ms. Brenda, Josh's teacher," she began. "I'd like to meet with you and your husband to discuss something about Josh. Are you available tomorrow?" The pause on the other end felt long and heavy. "Is something wrong?" Mrs. Timothy finally asked, her voice tight. "Not necessarily," Brenda said carefully. "But I do have some concerns, and I think it's important we talk." The next afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Timothy arrived at the school. They looked uneasy. Mr. Timothy, a tall man with a firm expression, folded his arms as they sat down. Mrs. Timothy, shorter and more nervous, glanced around the room, avoiding Brenda's eyes. "Thank you for coming," Brenda said, sitting across from them. "I've noticed that Josh seems tired lately, and I've seen some marks on his arms and neck. I just want to make sure everything is okay." Mrs. Timothy's face flushed. "Marks?" she echoed, glancing at her husband. "He's clumsy," Mr. Timothy said firmly. "He trips and falls all the time. He's always bruising himself." Brenda tilted her head slightly. "Has he seen a doctor about these injuries, or about his fatigue?" "We don't have all his medical records," Mrs. Timothy said quickly, wringing her hands. "Josh is adopted. We're still figuring everything out." Brenda's brows furrowed. "Adopted? From where?" "Another town," Mr. Timothy replied curtly. "We're doing the best we can, Ms. Brenda. We love Josh, and we're giving him a good home." "I understand," Brenda said, her voice steady. "But if there's more information about his health that I should know, it would help me support him better at school." The Timothys didn't respond immediately. Instead, Mr. Timothy stood abruptly. "If that's all, we should go." Mrs. Timothy hesitated, then followed her husband out the door. As they left, Brenda overheard her whisper, "Do you think she suspects something?" A week later, Josh came to school looking worse than ever. The marks on his arms were darker and more painful looking, and his movements were stiff, as if even sitting hurt him. Brenda's heart broke watching him struggle to hold his pencil. She couldn't wait any longer. That afternoon, she called Child Protective Services and filed a report. Within days, the police were at the Timothy's home. The couple looked stunned as they were accused of neglect and abuse. They insisted on their innocence, but the investigation moved forward. Josh was placed in temporary care while the case was prepared for court. Brenda sat alone in her classroom, staring at the empty desk where Josh usually sat. Her chest felt tight with guilt and worry. "Did I do the right thing?" she whispered. Little did she know, the truth was far from simple, and what was about to unfold would shock everyone. The courtroom was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of the prosecutor's pen against the table. Josh sat on the edge of a wooden bench, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing walls and towering adults around him. He clutched a tattered notebook to his chest, his fingers trembling slightly. At the front, Mr. and Mrs. Timothy sat stiffly, their faces pale. Mrs. Timothy dabbed her eyes with a tissue, while Mr. Timothy stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in a crisp navy suit, stood and turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice cold and deliberate, "the evidence is clear. These so-called foster parents have neglected their duty to provide proper care for this child." She clicked a button, and a large screen lit up with photos of Josh's arms, neck, and legs. Red, painful-looking marks were visible in every image. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. "Look at these injuries," the prosecutor continued. "No child should suffer like this under the care of supposed guardians." And yet, the Timothys didn't bother to seek medical attention. They failed him. They failed Josh. Mrs. Timothy broke into quiet sobs. Mr. Timothy gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The judge, a stern-faced man with a silver mustache, glanced at the couple. "Mr. and Mrs. Timothy, how do you respond to these accusations?" Mr. Timothy stood slowly, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. "Your Honor, we love Josh. We've done everything we can for him." "Everything." The prosecutor's voice cut through the room like a knife. "You didn't even take him to a doctor when these marks appeared. How is that everything?" "We didn't know," Mrs. Timothy began, but her voice cracked, and she couldn't finish. The prosecutor pounced. "Didn't know? You've been his foster parents for nearly a year, and you didn't know he needed medical care. That sounds like negligence, plain and simple." Josh gripped his notebook tighter, his lips pressed together. His eyes darted nervously between the prosecutor, the Timothys, and the judge. The judge raised a hand, silencing the room. "Mr. Timothy, Mrs. Timothy," he said gravely, "why didn't you report these injuries or seek medical help for Josh?" Mr. Timothy hesitated, his shoulders slumping. "When we adopted Josh, we didn't know about his condition. We weren't told anything. We thought he was just clumsy, that he bruised easily." Mrs. Timothy added, her voice trembling, "We didn't mean to ignore it. We tried to care for him, but we're not wealthy people. We don't have the money for specialists or tests. We were scared to tell anyone because we thought they'd take him away from us." The judge frowned, leaning back in his chair. "So you're saying you were unaware of his condition at the time of adoption?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Timothy replied. "But we love him. We've done our best to give him a good home." The prosecutor rolled her eyes. "Love isn't enough, Mr. Timothy. This child needed medical attention, and you failed him. I urge the court to impose the maximum sentence for this gross negligence." As the prosecutor sat down, Josh's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't stay silent anymore. He stood abruptly, his small voice cutting through the heavy tension. "Your Honor, I need to talk." The room went still. All eyes turned to him. "Josh, sit down," Mrs. Timothy whispered, her voice urgent. But Josh didn't move. His knuckles turned white around his notebook as he stepped toward the front of the courtroom. "Let the boy speak," the judge said, his voice calm but firm. Josh climbed onto the witness stand, his legs shaking. He looked up at the judge, then down at his notebook, gathering his courage. "Your Honor," Josh began, his voice wavering but firm. "They're innocent." The words rang through the room, clear and sharp, slicing through the tension like a knife. Gasps and murmurs rippled among the spectators. The prosecutor stood, a frown creasing her brow. The judge leaned forward, his silver mustache twitching. "Josh, can you explain what you mean by that?" Josh nodded, his knees wobbling as he spoke. "The red marks, the bruises, they're not because of Mr. and Mrs. Timothy. They didn't do anything bad. I've always been like this." Whispers spread through the crowd again. "What's he saying?" One voice murmured. "Is he trying to cover for them?" Another questioned. The prosecutor raised a hand, silencing the room. "Your Honor, with all due respect, Josh is just a child. He doesn't understand what's happening here. His testimony shouldn't be taken as fact." Josh's hands trembled, but he lifted his notebook. "I do understand," he said, his voice rising. Tears brimmed in his eyes, but he pressed on. "I've been sick for as long as I can remember. My skin gets these marks all the time, even when no one touches me." The judge studied Josh carefully, his expression softening. "Josh, do you have any proof of what you're saying?" Josh opened his notebook and carefully unfolded a crumpled piece of paper. It was a drawing, messy and colorful, with notes written in a child's scrawl. "This is from before I lived with them," Josh said, pointing to the date written on the bottom. "It's a picture I made at my old foster home. See, the red spots are on my arms, just like now. I've always had them." The prosecutor frowned, but the judge nodded for the paper to be passed forward. Mrs. Timothy's quiet sobbing broke through the silence. "Josh," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "you don't have to do this." "I do," Josh cried, turning to face her. "I need them to know the truth. They're going to take me away, and it's not fair." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The judge turned to the Timothys. "Mr. and Mrs. Timothy, is there anything you'd like to add to this?" Mr. Timothy hesitated, his throat working as he struggled to find the words. Finally, he stood, his voice low but steady. "Your Honor, we didn't know about Josh's condition when we adopted him. No one told us. We thought he just bruised easily because he was clumsy." Mrs. Timothy wiped her eyes, speaking through her tears. "We tried to help him. We did everything we could, but we don't have much money. Specialists, tests, they're so expensive. We just wanted to give him a home." "Why didn't you say any of this before?" the prosecutor asked, her voice sharp. Mrs. Timothy buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "We were afraid. We thought if we admitted we couldn't take care of him, they'd take him away from us. And we love him so much. He's our son." The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "Order." He turned to the prosecutor. "Do we have access to Josh's original foster care records?" The prosecutor hesitated. "I'll need time to retrieve them, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Do so immediately. This case hinges on understanding the full picture." The next day, the records arrived. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the clerk read aloud from the file. Josh's previous foster care records indicate a diagnosis of a rare genetic condition, the clerk said, her voice steady. "This disorder causes fragile skin, leading to marks and bruises that can resemble physical abuse. The records also confirm that the Timothys were not informed of this diagnosis during the adoption process." Gasps rippled through the room as the truth sunk in. The prosecutor's face turned pale, and she quickly sat down. The judge turned to Josh, his voice soft. "Thank you for your courage, Josh. You've helped us understand something very important." Josh looked up at the Timothys, his eyes glistening. "I told you they're innocent," he whispered. Mrs. Timothy rushed forward, pulling him into a tight hug, her tears soaking into his hair. "You're so brave," she murmured. The judge cleared his throat. "Given this new evidence, I will review the case further. In the meantime, I recommend immediate medical assistance for Josh and support for the Timothys to ensure he gets the care he needs." The courtroom erupted in whispers, but all Josh could hear was the sound of his parents' voices, reassuring him, telling him everything would be okay. For the first time in weeks, he believed them. The courtroom was tense as the judge re-entered after a brief recess. His usually composed demeanor was replaced with something softer, something vulnerable. He cleared his throat, looking at the Timothys with a steady gaze, then turned his attention to the rest of the courtroom. "I've heard all the evidence, and I've had time to reflect on the testimonies," the judge began, his voice thick with emotion. "It is clear to me that Mr. and Mrs. Timothy are not only innocent, but their love and devotion to their son, Josh, is unquestionable. They've fought through hardships that no parent should have to endure, and they've done it with grace and determination." The weight of the judge's words settled in the room like a heavy silence. Mr. and Mrs. Timothy's faces softened with relief, their hands clasped together tightly. Mrs. Timothy's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. The judge continued, his voice now stronger, but still filled with empathy. "I believe that we, as a society, owe it to families like the Timothys to offer more than just our words. They deserve not only our respect, but also our support, medical support, financial support, so that they can care for their children without the added burden of fear and uncertainty. Children with rare conditions, such as this Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, should not be a cause for distress, but a cause for action. It is time we take the necessary steps to make sure these families are not left to struggle alone." The courtroom remained silent, absorbing the gravity of the moment. The judge's plea for systemic change echoed in the hearts of those present, a call to action that would forever change the lives of families like the Timothys. Outside the courthouse, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the world. Josh stood with his parents, his arms wrapped tightly around them. He looked up at his mother, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew you'd tell them the truth." His mother hugged him tighter, her heart swelling with love and relief. "I'm so proud of you, Josh." Ms. Brenda approached them cautiously, her face filled with regret. "I'm so sorry for everything," she said softly. "I never meant for things to go this far. I just wanted to help." Mrs. Timothy smiled, wiping away a tear. "You were trying to protect him, Ms. Brenda. We understand. Are you enjoying this story? Do well to like, subscribe, and share. You are greatly appreciated. So let's continue." Josh, still holding his parents' hands, glanced up at Ms. Brenda. "It's okay, Ms. Brenda. We know you were just trying to help. You were there when we needed someone." Ms. Brenda's eyes welled up with tears as she smiled back at him. She had feared she had made the situation worse, but in that moment, she realized how much love and strength they had within their family. As they turned to walk away, Josh looked back one last time at the courthouse. His eyes met the judge's, who stood near the door, watching them. Josh's voice carried across the courtyard. "Thank you for listening," he said softly. The judge, now pale and visibly emotional, nodded. "Thank you for teaching me," he replied, his voice trembling. And with that, the family walked away, their steps lighter, their hearts full of hope, as the courtroom doors slowly closed behind them. The fight had been long, but it had brought about change. And in that change, there was a promise of better days ahead. Thank you so much for watching. Your presence truly means the world to us. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. It's the best way to support us and keep the inspiration flowing. Please like, share, and engage with us. And together, let's advocate for those living with rare diseases. I'll be in the comments, ready to reply and connect with you. Let us know where you're watching from. We can't wait to hear from you.